Mama. In a mansion silenced by grief and shaken by storm, a 3-year-old boy who had never spoken breaks his silence, calling a stranger by the name that once belonged to the dead. Now, a father must choose, cling to the memory that defines his loss, or face the miracle unfolding before his eyes. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of a father who feared hope, and the gentle stranger who taught him how to believe again. Autumn had painted Maplewood Estate in shades of copper and gold, the kind of beauty that made loneliness ache deeper. The grand colonial mansion stood at the edge of Concord, Massachusetts, its white pillars catching the last of the October light, as dusk settled over the manicured lawns. Inside, the silence was deliberate, cultivated, like the rose garden Caroline Whitmore had once tended with such devotion. Henry Whitmore moved through the hallway on the second floor, his leather shoes whispering against the Persian runner. At 53 years old, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had learned to bear weight without bending. 2 years had passed since Caroline's funeral. 2 years since the world had split into before and after. The twins had been only 1 year old then, too young to understand why their mother's voice had vanished from the nursery, too small to know that their silence would become his penance. The nursery door stood halfway open, warm light spilling into the dim corridor. Henry paused just outside, his hand resting against the doorframe. Through the gap, he could see Isabel Martinez, the new care aide the agency had sent 3 weeks prior. She was young, perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that moved with surprising gentleness as she folded tiny shirts into neat squares. Her quiet humming filled the space, a melody he did not recognize, but one that seemed to soften the air itself. Lucas and Mateo sat on the thick carpet near her feet, their 3-year-old bodies small and still. They had never spoken, not a word, not a sound beyond crying. The specialists had used terms Henry tried not to remember: global developmental delay, nonverbal, uncertain prognosis. Dr. Alan Kellman, the neurologist from Boston General, had been blunt during the last assessment. The chances of meaningful change were minimal, he had said, his clinical tone suggesting Henry should adjust his expectations accordingly. Isabel reached for a stuffed elephant, placing it gently in Lucas's lap. The boy's dark eyes, so much like Caroline's, tracked the movement, but offered nothing in return. Isabel smiled anyway, that same patient smile she wore every day, and continued her soft humming. The sound wrapped around the room like a blanket, undemanding and warm. Then it happened. Lucas's lips parted, his small chest rising with effort, and a single syllable emerged, fragile as spun glass. Ma. The humming stopped. Isabel's hands froze mid-fold, her eyes widening as she looked down at the child. Henry's breath caught in his throat, his entire body locking into place. That one whispered sound, barely more than breath, shaped into meaning, shattered the carefully constructed fortress he had built around his grief. It was not Caroline's name the boy had tried to say, and yet the ghost of her voice seemed to fill the hallway, pressing against Henry's chest until he could not breathe. He stood there, gripping the doorframe, unable to move forward or pull away. Isabel's gaze lifted and found his through the half-open door. Her expression held no triumph, no expectation, only a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, something neither of them could yet name. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of hope. Henry had sworn never to carry again. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed noon, with mechanical precision, counting out the hours that Henry Whitmore had organized into an unbreakable structure. 3 weeks had passed since that whispered syllable in the nursery, 3 weeks during which Henry had convinced himself it meant nothing at all. He ran the household like a military operation because routine was the only defense against the kind of hope that could destroy a man twice in one lifetime. The nurses arrived at 8 in the morning, their uniforms crisp and professional. The physical therapist came at 10, manipulating the twins' small limbs through prescribed exercises documented on clipboards. The speech pathologist visited on Tuesdays and Thursdays, presenting flashcards that produced no response. Meals were served at noon sharp. Every hour had its purpose, every interaction its boundary. Isabel Martinez moved through this regimented world like water finding paths around stone. She followed the instructions in the 3-ring binder Henry maintained on the kitchen counter, checking off tasks with dutiful precision. Yet there was something in the way she worked that defied the sterile efficiency he demanded. When she changed the twins' clothing, her fingers lingered an extra moment, smoothing fabric against their small shoulders. When she cleaned the nursery, she hummed under her breath, melodies that seemed to come from some deep well of memory Henry could not access. And always, she maintained gentle eye contact with Lucas and Mateo, speaking to them as though they could understand every word, as though their silence was merely a language she had not yet learned to interpret. Henry watched from doorways and through security monitors he had installed throughout the house. He told himself it was necessary supervision, quality control for the expensive care he provided. But there were moments when his hand would freeze on the keyboard in his study. His eyes fixed on the screen showing Isabel singing softly as she worked, and something in his chest would tighten with a feeling he refused to name. On a gray Thursday afternoon, Dr. Alan Kelman arrived for the twins' regular reassessment, his leather medical bag worn smooth from decades of house calls. He was 61 years old, with silver hair, and the kind of clinical detachment that came from witnessing too many heartbreaks to invest emotionally in any single case. Henry led him to the nursery where Isabel had the twins dressed in matching blue sweaters, seated on the carpet with soft toys arranged in a careful semicircle. The examination was thorough and impersonal. Dr. Kelman tested reflexes, shone lights into unresponsive eyes, made notes on his tablet with swift strokes. Isabel stood near the window, her hands folded at her waist, watching with an expression Henry could not read. When the doctor finally straightened and turned to face Henry, his verdict was delivered with measured calm. "Their chances of change are minimal, Mr. Whitmore. Realistic expectations are crucial for everyone's well-being." The words landed like stones in still water. Henry felt his jaw tighten, his hands curling into fists at his sides, but he forced his face into neutrality, nodding once with mechanical acceptance. Behind Dr. Kelman, Isabel's eyes met his for just a moment, and in that glance, Henry saw something that looked uncomfortably like pity mixed with quiet defiance. After the doctor left, Henry stood alone in his study, staring at Caroline's photograph on the mahogany desk. He convinced himself it had been only reflex, that whispered sound 3 weeks ago, a trick of acoustics and desperate imagination. The fortress of routine held firm, its walls high and unyielding, because to believe otherwise would mean tearing them down. And Henry Whitmore had forgotten how to live without walls. The afternoon light slanted through the study windows in pale gold bars, illuminating dust motes that drifted through air grown stale from disuse. Isabel Martinez moved carefully between the mahogany shelves, her cloth catching accumulated dust of months, perhaps years of deliberate avoidance. Henry Whitmore had not entered this room since Caroline's death, preferring the smaller office upstairs where memories did not press against him. The study had been Caroline's favorite place, where her presence still lingered in the faint scent of lavender sachets tucked between volumes. Isabel worked methodically, wiping down leather spines and straightening rows of books that had begun to lean like tired soldiers. When she reached the bottom shelf near the bay window, she noticed a gap behind the second row, a space where the books did not quite meet the wall. Curious, she slid several volumes forward and reached into the darkness. Her fingers brushed against something small and bound in fabric, wedged into the corner as though hidden deliberately or forgotten in haste. She pulled it free and found herself holding a small blue journal, its cover made of soft cloth faded to the color of winter sky. The binding was worn along the edges, and when Isabel carefully opened the first page, she saw handwriting that flowed across the paper with elegant loops, the script of someone who had taken time with words because words mattered. Caroline Whitmore's name appeared on the inside cover in that same graceful hand, along with a date from 4 years prior, back when the twins had been nothing more than hopeful possibility. Isabel turned the pages slowly, reverently, feeling like an intruder yet unable to stop reading. The journal held fragments of Caroline's inner life, small joys documented with tender precision. But scattered throughout were lullabies, original melodies written in careful notation with lyrics beneath, songs composed for children not yet born. One song appeared multiple times across different pages, clearly a favorite, its melody simple enough for a mother to hum while rocking babies to sleep. The lyrics spoke of moonlight and oak trees, of safe harbors and endless love, words that carried fierce maternal devotion even in their gentle simplicity. Isabel traced the notes with her fingertip, hearing the melody form in her mind, feeling its rhythm settle into her bones. That night, after the household had fallen into silence and Henry had retreated to his upstairs office, Isabel prepared the twins for bed with her customary patience. She changed them into soft pajamas, brushed their fine, dark hair, settled them into their cribs with the night light casting warm shadows across the nursery walls. Then, instead of leaving as she normally did, she pulled the rocking chair close and began to hum. The melody from Caroline's journal rose from her throat unbidden, as natural as breathing, the notes finding their proper places without conscious effort. Isabel's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. But it filled the room with something that had been missing, some essential warmth that sterile routine could never provide. Their breathing began to shift, settling into a slower rhythm that matched the lullaby's gentle pace. Lucas's eyes, which had been staring blankly at the mobile above his crib, gradually tracked toward Isabel's face, following the source of the sound. Mateo's tiny hand, which had been lying motionless at his side, trembled slightly, fingers curling and uncurling as though reaching for something just beyond grasp. Something faint stirred in the air between them, fragile and tentative, like the first breath of spring after endless winter, and Isabel felt tears prick her eyes though she could not have explained why. The therapy routines had been designed by specialists from Boston. General protocols delivered in binders with laminated instruction sheets demonstrating proper hand placement, correct angles for limb manipulation, and precise duration for each exercise. They were clinical blueprints meant to maintain muscle tone, maintenance protocols without expectation of transformation. Isabel Martinez had been following them with the same dutiful precision she applied to everything else, checking off completed tasks in the log Henry Whitmore reviewed each evening. But something had shifted in the way she approached the work now, some subtle alteration in her touch that could not be documented on any checklist. She still followed the sequences exactly as prescribed, guiding small arms through their ranges of motion, massaging tiny legs with therapeutic pressure, supporting the twins' heads as she helped them practice sitting positions. Yet her movements had acquired a quality of attention that went beyond mechanical compliance, a gentleness infused with expectation rather than resignation. She incorporated techniques the specialists had taught, adding layers they had never mentioned. Gentle touch became conversation conducted through fingertips, each contact a question waiting for response. The prescribed exercises were performed to rhythm, Isabel humming softly as she worked, creating patterns of sound and sensation that the twins' nervous systems could begin to map and anticipate. She sang while she stretched their limbs, spoke to them in continuous narrative while working their joints, treating their silence not as absence but as listening. The changes began so subtly that another caregiver might have dismissed them as random fluctuation. But Isabel noticed everything. She observed how Lucas's breathing no longer came in shallow, irregular patterns that had characterized his first 3 years, but had begun to steady and deepen, his small chest rising and falling with increased rhythm during the therapy sessions. She watched how Mateo's eyes, which had previously stared past objects without focus, now tracked movement with deliberate intention, following her hands as she demonstrated exercises before performing them on his brother. Henry watched through the CCTV feed in his study, the security monitor showing grainy images of the nursery where Isabel worked with patient dedication. He found himself drawn to the screen more frequently than supervision required, his fingers pausing on the keyboard as he observed scenes that stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. The way she moved with the twins held echoes of Caroline. That same quality of absolute presence, as though nothing else in the world existed beyond the small bodies in her care. He was caught between disbelief and something more dangerous than hope, a feeling he could not name because naming it would give it power. Part of him insisted these were merely physiological adjustments, meaningless variations that any competent therapist could produce. But another part, the part he tried to silence with logic, and Dr. Kellman's clinical assessments, whispered that something genuine was happening in that nursery, something the specialists had declared impossible. The sterile quiet that had defined Maplewood Estate for 2 years, that heavy silence. broken only by mechanical sounds of medical equipment and efficient movements of professional caregivers, had begun to shift in ways Henry could not quantify but could no longer ignore. There was a quality to the air now when he walked past the nursery, a sense of potential energy gathering like static before a storm. For the first time since Caroline's funeral, something felt alive again. And Henry Whitmore stood frozen between his computer screen and the nursery door, terrified of what that might mean. The morning arrived with crystalline clarity that only October could provide, the sky swept clean and rendered in shades of blue so pure they seemed almost artificial. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of Maplewood Estate, casting long patterns across the hardwood floors. Isabel Martinez had been preparing since dawn, gathering soft blankets and positioning the twins' adaptive stroller. Near the French doors that opened onto the back terrace, her movements efficient but touched with nervous anticipation. She had mentioned the idea to Henry Whitmore 3 days prior, suggesting in her careful way that fresh air might benefit the boys. He had neither approved nor forbidden it, offering only a noncommittal nod that Isabel chose to interpret as permission. The twins had never been outside, not once in their 3 years beyond the brief trip from hospital to home as infants. The world inside the mansion walls was controlled, sterile, safe from variables that could not be managed. But Isabel had decided that safety without experience was its own kind of deprivation. And so she dressed Lucas and Mateo in soft cotton shirts and tiny jackets, supporting their heads as she settled them into the specialized stroller. She wheeled them through the French doors and onto the flagstone terrace. Then down the gentle ramp that accessibility consultants had installed years ago at Caroline's insistence. The garden spread before them in autumn glory, the maple trees blazing in shades of crimson and gold, their leaves catching sunlight and transforming it into living fire. The air carried the scent of turned earth and dying foliage, mixed with chrysanthemums still blooming in their beds. Wind moved through the space in gentle currents, rustling leaves and creating a symphony of natural sounds that bore no resemblance to the mechanical hum of medical equipment. Isabel pushed the stroller onto the lawn and stopped near a patch of grass where sunlight fell unobstructed. She knelt beside the twins, her hands moving to support them as she carefully lifted first Lucas, then Mateo, settling them on the soft blanket she had spread across the ground. Their small bodies tensed at first, unfamiliar muscles contracting against the strangeness of being outdoors, of feeling wind against their skin and sunlight on their faces. Then something extraordinary began to happen. Lucas's eyes, which had been squeezed shut against the brightness, slowly opened and began to track the movement of leaves overhead, following their drift and dance with something that looked almost like wonder. His small hand lifted from the blanket, trembling with effort, fingers reaching toward the grass beside him, touching the blades with tentative exploration. Mateo blinked rapidly against the light, his breathing changing rhythm, and when a particularly strong gust of wind rustled through the maple branches, his lips parted and a sound emerged, not quite a laugh but close enough to make Isabel's breath catch. From his parked car at the edge of the circular driveway, Henry Whitmore sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, watching as this scene unfolded. He had been leaving for a meeting downtown when he noticed Isabel wheeling the stroller toward the garden. And something had compelled him to stop, to observe as she did what Caroline had once dreamed of doing, what he himself had been too afraid to attempt. Envy twisted in his chest, sharp and bitter, mixing with guilt until he could not distinguish one from the other. Someone else was reaching his sons in ways he had never managed, breaking through barriers he had accepted as permanent. That night, alone in his bedroom, Henry stood before Caroline's photograph on the dresser. The silver frame cool beneath his fingertips, and whispered into the silence words that felt like confession and accusation both. "She's doing what you did, what I couldn't." The confrontation came on a Tuesday afternoon, sudden and inevitable as thunder after lightning. Henry Whitmore had been watching Isabel through the nursery doorway, observing the way she cradled Lucas while humming that melody from Caroline's journal. The one she could not possibly have known except by finding what had been hidden. The sight triggered something primal in him, territorial rage mixed with grief so raw it felt like physical pain. He stepped into the room with deliberate heaviness, his footfalls announcing his presence. Isabel turned toward him, still holding Lucas, her expression open and unguarded in a way that only intensified his fury because it revealed no consciousness of transgression. Henry's jaw was tight, muscles along his neck standing out in sharp relief as he forced words through the constriction in his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged low and controlled, each syllable precisely articulated. "They already have a mother." The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through the careful professional distance Isabel had maintained. She did not flinch, did not lower her eyes or shift Lucas's weight. Instead, she held Henry's gaze with steadiness that bordered on defiance, though her voice when she responded remained soft, carrying no edge of challenge. "Then be the one who reaches first." The simplicity of it struck Henry like a blow to the solar plexus, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him momentarily speechless. There was no judgment in her tone, no condemnation, only a statement of fact delivered with gentle clarity that cut deeper than any accusation. She was not trying to replace Caroline, her posture said. She was simply filling the space that grief had left vacant, doing what needed to be done because someone had to do it. The tension that followed was thick enough to choke on, a heavy presence that filled the nursery and pressed against the walls. Isabel did not retreat or apologize, did not offer platitudes or justifications. She simply stood there, still holding Lucas, meeting Henry's anger with something that looked uncomfortably like compassion mixed with quiet, unyielding conviction. She would not argue with him, her silence suggested, but neither would she abandon her post. Henry felt his hands curling into fists at his sides, felt the urge to impose order through authority, to reassert control over a household that seemed to be slipping through his fingers. But something in Isabel's steady gaze stopped him, some quality of certainty that made his anger feel suddenly hollow, a defensive reaction. Masking the deeper terror that she might be right, that his careful distance from his own sons was not protection but abandonment dressed in respectable clothing. He turned and left without another word, his retreat feeling less like victory than surrender. And the door closing behind him sounded like the final note of a conversation that had fundamentally altered their relationship. Isabel never raised her voice, never left her post, never gave ground on the essential truth she had spoken. Later that evening, Dr. Kelman returned for another assessment, his clinical detachment unchanged by the emotional weather of the household. After examining the twins with his usual thoroughness, he delivered his verdict with the same measured tone. "These are sensory reactions, Mr. Whitmore, not language. The improvements you're perceiving are normal neurological adjustments to consistent stimulation." Henry listened in silence, his faith in miracles cracking under the weight of medical authority. Even as some stubborn part of him whispered that doctors did not know everything, that science had limits when confronted with the unpredictable territory of human resilience. The thunderstorm arrived without warning, rolling in from the Atlantic with violent suddenness. By 8 in the evening, the sky over Concord had turned the color of bruised flesh, and rain began to hammer against the windows of Maplewood Estate with percussive force. Lightning fractured the darkness in jagged white lines, each flash followed by thunder that shook the foundation. Then the power failed. The house plunged into absolute darkness, that particular blackness that comes when every artificial light dies simultaneously. The hum of climate control, the buzz of medical monitors, all vanished at once, leaving only the raw sound of the storm and the pounding of Henry Whitmore's heart as he stood frozen in his upstairs office. His first thought was the twins. In the nursery below, Lucas and Mateo would be terrified, their nervous systems overwhelmed by sensory assault they could not understand. Henry fumbled for his phone, using its pale glow to navigate the hallway and down the stairs, his hand gripping the banister as thunder crashed overhead. He reached the nursery door and pushed it open, expecting chaos. Instead, he found Isabel Martinez sitting on the floor between their cribs, holding both boys in her lap, her body curved around them protectively. She was singing, her voice rising clear through the darkness, cutting through the storm's fury with a melody Henry recognized with visceral shock. It was the lullaby from Caroline's Blue Journal, the one his wife had composed years ago. The song she had hummed while pregnant with dreams of children she would never see grow. Isabel sang it now with perfect fidelity to the original melody, and the twins were not crying. They were still, their breathing synchronized to the rhythm of the song. Their small bodies relaxed against Isabel's chest as though the storm did not exist beyond the circle of her arms. Henry stood paralyzed in the doorway, his throat constricting with emotion so powerful it felt like drowning. The scene seemed impossible, a vision conjured from grief. Yet it was real, illuminated in flashes of lightning that turned the nursery into stark photographs burned into his memory. Isabel's face in the intermittent light showed no fear, only fierce concentration and protective tenderness. His voice emerged broken, barely more than a whisper rasped through the tightness in his chest. "How do you know that song?" Isabel looked up, her singing pausing as she reached beside her and lifted the worn blue journal, holding it out toward him like an offering. Henry took it with trembling hands, feeling the soft fabric cover, remembering how Caroline had carried it everywhere during those last months before the twins were born. How it had disappeared after her death and he had never thought to search for it. Then something miraculous happened. In Isabel's lap, Lucas stirred and his lips parted, forming a word that emerged clear and unmistakable despite his 3 years of silence. Isa. And Mateo, as though awakened by his brother's voice, echoed him with his own whispered syllable, the first word he had ever spoken. Isa. The sound of their voices, fragile and new but undeniably real, shattered the last of Henry's defenses. He dropped to his knees beside them, the journal falling from his hands as tears cut through 2 years of restraint. 2 years of carefully maintained emotional distance collapsing in an instant. He reached out with shaking hands and gathered all 3 of them into his embrace. Isabel and the twins together, his body shaking with sobs that tore through him like the lightning tearing through the sky outside. The storm raged on, but inside the nursery, something fundamental had shifted. In the darkness lit only by lightning flashes, a father had finally reached for his sons, and they had answered. The days following the storm carried a different quality of light through Maplewood Estate, as though something in the atmosphere had been cleansed. Henry Whitmore moved through the house with altered awareness, no longer avoiding the nursery, but entering tentatively, like a man learning to inhabit rooms he had abandoned. He sat near the twins during therapy sessions, occasionally reaching out to touch a small hand, his gestures uncertain but genuine. Then the letter arrived. Isabel found it in her mailbox on a Thursday morning, the return address printed in crisp letterhead from the Riverside Rehabilitation Center in Manhattan. She read it standing in the kitchen, the morning sun illuminating words that offered everything she had worked toward: a senior therapist position, generous salary, comprehensive benefits, apartment assistance in Manhattan, and professional recognition that could define a career. She folded the letter and placed it in her pocket, her face revealing nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she prepared the twins' breakfast. Henry noticed the change immediately, that subtle withdrawal in her posture, the way her humming had stopped. He did not ask about it. Instead, 2 days later, he appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a manila envelope, his expression carefully neutral. Isabel was cleaning the counters, her back to him, and she did not turn even when his footfalls announced his presence. Henry cleared his throat, a sound that carried the weight of rehearsed speeches abandoned in favor of raw honesty. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been fear or gratitude or both. "I know about the offer from New York." Isabel's hands stilled on the cloth, but she did not turn to face him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications and futures balanced on the edge of decision. Henry stepped closer and placed the envelope on the counter beside her, his fingers lingering on it before he withdrew, maintaining the physical distance that still felt necessary. "This is a document I had my attorney prepare. Co-care authorization. It has no legal weight in custody terms, but it acknowledges you as someone essential to their lives. Someone who will be remembered regardless of what you choose." Isabel finally turned, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that made Henry want to look away but forced himself to hold steady. She reached for the envelope but did not open it, simply held it against her chest as though it might contain something more fragile than paper. Henry's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, the words stripped of pretense, offered simply as truth. "No legal weight, but it means they'll never forget you." Isabel stood motionless, her expression unreadable, but Henry saw the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her breath caught and held before releasing in a slow exhale. The document represented acknowledgement without obligation, recognition without chains. Henry's way of saying that whatever she decided, she had changed them all irrevocably. She said nothing in response, but her silence was heavy with conflict, pregnant with the weight of a choice that would define not just her own future, but the trajectories of 3 lives that had become tangled with hers in ways neither could have predicted. The envelope remained pressed against her heart, and Henry left the kitchen without another word, understanding that some decisions required solitude and could not be rushed. That evening, Isabel sat alone in her small room, the job offer spread on one side of her desk, Henry's document on the other, 2 possible futures laid out like roads, diverging in opposite directions, and she stared at both until darkness made the choice no clearer. The twins turned 3 years old on a Saturday morning in late November. When autumn had surrendered to early winter and frost painted delicate patterns on the window panes, Henry Whitmore had arranged a small celebration, inviting only a handful of people: the physical therapist, 2 of Caroline's sisters from Connecticut, the nurse who handled their checkups, and Isabel Martinez, whose presence had become as essential as oxygen or light. The dining room had been prepared with careful restraint, no balloons or excessive decorations. Just a white tablecloth across the mahogany table and a small white cake with 3 candles waiting to be lit. The cake was vanilla, simple and unpretentious, chosen because Henry had no idea what flavors his sons might prefer. The guests gathered around the table with careful cheerfulness. Lucas and Mateo sat in their adaptive chairs, positioned where they could see the cake, their small bodies supported by cushions. Their eyes tracked the movement around them with more focus than they had possessed months before. Isabel stood near the twins, her hand resting lightly on Lucas's shoulder. She wore a simple dress the color of deep blue, and when she caught Henry's eye across the table, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of how far they had all traveled. Henry lit the candles with hands that trembled slightly, the small flames casting warm light across the white surface and reflecting in the eyes of everyone gathered. The group began to sing Happy Birthday in scattered harmony, and when they reached the final note and everyone leaned forward in anticipation, Lucas suddenly lifted his small hand and pointed directly at Isabel. His voice emerged clear and deliberate, carrying across the sudden silence that fell over the room like snow settling on still water. "Mama." The single word landed with the force of a revelation, and before anyone could react, Mateo turned his head toward Isabel as well, his face breaking into something that resembled a smile, and he laughed, the sound bright and unexpected as bells, before echoing his brother with perfect clarity. "Mama." The room froze. Caroline's sisters stood with their hands pressed against their mouths, tears already streaming down their faces. The therapist's eyes went wide, her professional composure cracking to reveal genuine shock. The nurse gripped the edge of the table as though the floor had suddenly become unsteady. But Henry saw none of this. His entire focus had narrowed to Isabel's face, watching as she stood perfectly still, her hand still resting on Lucas's shoulder. Her expression cycling through surprise and joy and something that looked almost like pain, as though the gift the twins had given her was too precious to accept without acknowledging its cost. She did not correct them, did not explain that she was not their mother, did not redirect their affection toward the memory of the woman whose photograph hung upstairs. Instead, Henry watched as Isabel slowly closed her eyes, one hand lifting to cover her heart, and nodded with a grace that spoke of acceptance without claim, of love without possession. And in that gesture, Henry felt something fundamental settle into place within his own chest. Some piece of architecture that had been missing since Caroline's death finally clicking into position. He closed his own eyes and nodded slowly, a man finally surrendering control to grace. Acknowledging that love did not diminish by being shared but multiplied, that honoring Caroline's memory did not require keeping her sons frozen in grief, and that Isabel's presence was not replacement but continuation. Spring returned to Maplewood Estate with gentle insistence that makes winter's grip seem like a distant memory. The garden that had stood dormant through frozen weeks began to show signs of renewal, green shoots pushing through dark earth, buds swelling on maple branches, and everywhere the sound of birds returning, their songs filling the air with promises of transformation. The garden had been replanted over the past weeks, Henry working alongside a landscaper to restore the beds Caroline had once tended. New perennials had been placed where old ones had died, pathways cleared, and beneath the largest maple tree. A new swing had been installed, its seat wide enough to accommodate multiple occupants, suspended from thick chains that creaked gently. On a Saturday afternoon when light fell through new leaves in patterns of gold and green, Henry Whitmore pushed Lucas and Mateo through the French doors. Isabel Martinez walked beside him, her hand resting on Mateo's shoulder, and together they made their way to where the swing waited beneath dappled shade. The twins were stronger now, their muscle tone improved enough that they could sit with minimal support, their heads turning to track movement. Their eyes bright with awareness that had been absent before. Henry settled onto the swing first, positioning himself carefully before Isabel helped lift Lucas into his lap. Then Isabel sat beside them with Mateo cradled against her chest, the four of them sharing the wide seat, their combined weight causing the chains to sing softly as Henry pushed off with his foot and sent them swaying gently through the air. The motion was soothing, rhythmic, and the twins relaxed into it with visible contentment, their breathing synchronizing with the back-and-forth movement. For a long time, no one spoke. They simply existed together in that suspended moment, swaying beneath the maple trees while wind moved through branches overhead and carried the scent of turned earth and growing things. Henry felt something in his chest loosen and release, some final knot of resistance that had been holding him rigid finally coming undone, allowing him to settle into this present moment without being haunted by the past or terrified of the future. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged quiet and contemplative, barely louder than the whisper of wind through new leaves. It wasn't a miracle. It was just someone staying. Isabel turned her head to look at him, and in her eyes Henry saw understanding without judgment, acceptance without demand. She had stayed when leaving would have been easier, had remained present when presence required more courage than flight, had loved without guarantee of return, and in that steadfast commitment, she had accomplished what all the specialists and protocols could not. Above them, a wind chime that Isabel had hung from one of the maple branches began to ring, its clear tones cutting through the afternoon air. Lucas lifted his small hand toward the sound, his fingers spreading as though trying to catch the notes. And Mateo laughed, that bright bell sound that still seemed miraculous every time Henry heard it. The camera would pull back now if this were a film, drawing away from the four figures on the swing, showing them as they existed in the larger context of the garden and the estate beyond. There was no grand victory here, no triumphant music swelling to announce that all problems had been solved. There was only life breathing again, hesitant and fragile but undeniably real, four people learning to exist together in the complicated space where grief and hope occupied the same geography. Where the past could be honored without imprisoning the present. The swing continued its gentle arc through dappled light, and spring settled over them like a blessing they had not known they were waiting to receive. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive with miracles or grand gestures. It simply stays quiet, steady, and real. If this story touched your heart, share it, leave a thought below. And stay with us for the next story where kindness finds its way again. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.